Well, thank you. And tonight's subject is Tracing Your Ancestors, the Table of Nations, based on Genesis chapter 10. And I don't know about you, but a lot of people have got a real interest in trying to trace their roots. I don't know whether you've tried to find your family tree. It's quite an interesting subject. A lot of people doing that these days. More recently, people have been trying to trace their ancestors through DNA tracing. Send off a sample. You can do it on the internet and check where to send it off to and so on. You can do all that and find out where you've come from, apparently. Well, I won't be going into DNA tracing. I'll be looking more at a historical point of view tonight. But just as we move on now, tonight's talk, we're going to be looking at several things. Firstly, post-flood civilization. Because what we're looking at, Genesis chapter 10, is after the flood of Noah and what happened to Noah and his descendants and where those families, those tribes, those clans, where they spread through and migrated in the ancient world. So we're looking at what happened after the flood. We're going to be looking at the founders of what I call the New World, really, because the old world, as they knew it, was pretty wrecked and they had to start again. So Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. We look at Ham and his descendants and where they went. We're going to look at Shem and his descendants and where they ended up, and Japheth and his descendants. And lastly, we'll have a conclusion. So let's, first of all, before we get into the actual Genesis chapter 10, just a recap. Firstly, Genesis, it speaks about chapter 6 to 9 of being a global flood, not a local. I remember when I was doing archaeology and speaking to my professor at the time, and he told me that the flood was the result of the ice melting in Lake Van and the water pouring down into the Mesopotamian civilization. But according to the Bible, it was a global flood. Second thing is the date of the flood being about 3000 BC, and also that the flood was known by all ancient cultures. It was a common record. When we look in the clay tablets and the ancient writings, we find this amazing story about what happened. And if you look at there on the right picture, the picture down at the bottom right, is a section of a clay tablet about the Gilgamesh epic, and it speaks about the flood, the Babylonian version of it, and some of them were really quite ancient. According to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, the first century, parts of Noah's Ark still existed in the Mount Ararat range. He says here in his book Antiquities, it is said that there is still some part of the ship in Armenia at the mountain called the Cordaians, and that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen which they take away and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Hieronymus, the Egyptian also, who wrote the Phoenician Antiquities, and Niaces and a great many more make mention of the same. So it was common knowledge, not just about Bible-believing historians, but actually pagan and others. Everyone knew about the remains of the Noah's Ark in the Mount Ararat range, just as the Bible said. I want to mention what I call carbon-14 disclaimer, and there's a reason for that, because when we're looking at these things, we're looking at historical records. Carbon-14 disclaimer. The reason I mention that is because I'm only using historical dating methods with archaeology, and I'm not getting into prehistoric theories. The thing about carbon-14 is it cannot be calibrated beyond 3000 BC for the simple reason you can't test it against any kind of historical records. We've been led to believe that carbon dating can be used for 20,000, 30,000 BC or something, and we get these pictures of sort of prehistoric people. And even actually within the last centuries or last few thousand years, you have a lot of wrong readings. In fact, over 50% of them get rejected. It makes you wonder why the less than half of them even get accepted in the first place. If you want to ask questions about that later on, do get back to me. But Dr. Libby was the person who discovered carbon dating, and he actually said himself, "The first shock Dr. Arnold and I had was that our advisors informed us that history extended only back 5,000 years. We'd initially thought that we would be able to get samples along the curve back to 30,000 years, put the points in, and then our work would be finished. We learned rather abruptly that these numbers, these ancient ages, are not known. In fact, it is about the time of the first dynasty in Egypt that the last or the earliest historical date of any real certainty has been established. So we're looking at the last 5,000 years. So let's move on. The first part tonight, post-flood civilization. And if you have a look at the map there, you can see the shaded bits of brown all around Turkey. It's known by archaeologists as Anatolia. Anatolia is a region basically that includes Turkey, Armenia, northern Syria, and western Iran, where the brown shading is. If you look on this map, you can see on the right-hand side, you can see Lake Van. There's another lake just below it, which is not named, but that's Lake Urmia. And above those two lakes, you have a river called Araxes, is where the Mount Ararat range actually is, where, according to the Bible, was Noah and his descendants got out of the ark and descended from that point. So, according to archaeologists, this is the area where civilization began. Now, I don't know about you, but I was brought up with Sumeria in ancient Iraq being the first sort of major civilization. But that's shifted since then, and now it's Anatolia very much, which is the great excitement. Let's have a look at a number of things. For example, in Anatolia, that particular region, archaeologists they have a diffusion theory of the origin of agriculture. And if you look on the map there, you'll see going on over to the west, just above Africa, you'll find the Fertile Crescent. If you just see that there, Fertile Crescent, and that was the beginning, according to their tracing of people movements, where simple agriculture first began and the growing of corn for that purpose. Now, first domestication, also according to the archaeologists, also took place in the same region, can be traced back to that. We also find that first metalworks were also traced back to that place, that area, Medzamor. In fact, Medzamor is not far from Ararat, about 15 miles from there. And they've dug up what would have been about 200 furnaces. They found all sorts of metalwork. They found works from precious stones, tin, iron, even, this is extraordinary, they found steel tweezers, which you wouldn't expect to find, would you? Because they're not supposed to be, apparently, so sophisticated. But these have been found amongst the archaeological artifacts there. We find in Anatolia, if you like wine, the most ancient wine is a Chateau Arata, and it comes just in what's called the Mandeb Plain, near the Ararat Range. Got a picture there of a vineyard just beneath the mountains. The interesting thing about it, if you read Genesis, of course, after the flood, Noah planted a vineyard. It would have been, I guess, just below those mountains. And unfortunately, he got a bit drunk. But just gives you some idea of the kind of place there. And we find the first evidence we have of wine growing and of wine was that same region. We find that the first towns appear in the same region. And Catalhoyuk is also very well known. Professor James Mallart did a lot of excavation work in the 1960s onwards, and they're quite extraordinary sort of houses because they're flat and they have all these ladders and sort of holes going through. That's what they reckon as they reconstructed based on the evidence they could see. But they reckon that was the beginning of the first towns in the same region. We find too the first pottery. If you look on the left-hand side, you find simple greenish brown kind of potwork they had. Later on, they developed another kind of pot with red paintings on them. And it spread there throughout the ancient world from that place. We also find the first simple observatory for astronomy at a place called Karahunj near Sisian. And this is a fairly recent thing, but it seems to be a forerunner of like a Stonehenge. And a team of scientists went up there to examine it and to test it and found it appears to be the first place for astronomy, again in the same region as the Bible speaks about.